This young man didn't have much going for him, really. He's 24 here, slim, a little over 6 feet tall, born in 1823. You might guess from his clothes that he's not really very well off, and you'll be right. His father had a small income, nothing much, but he was a fairly idle man and he didn't really look after his children. And this young man was the 8th out of 9 children. And his name was Alfred Russel Wallace. And he was born in a small town where his father happened to be staying for a short period on the borders of Wales and England. They didn't stay there long. And when he was about 4, he moved with the family to a small village just to the north of London called Hertford. But he left school when he was just over 13, and thereafter educated himself pretty well. He worked as a carpenter for one of his brothers and as a surveyor for another of his brothers. And during that time, he began to feel something about the countryside in which he grew up, in particular about the flowers. He started to try and classify the flowers, put names to the flowers. It was the beginning of the birth of what was to be one of the great naturalists that the world has ever seen. And when, in 1843, he moved to Leicester, which was a city in the middle of England, to work as a teacher. And it was there that he met another man, a couple of years younger than him, called Henry Bates. And Henry Bates, too, had this passion, this love for the natural world. And Henry Bates astonished Wallace by saying that within a 10-mile radius of the city of Leicester, he had collected 1,000 different species of beetles. And it astonished Wallace, as it astonished Bates, and as it had astonished 15 years earlier another English naturalist called Charles Darwin. Why were there so many? What possible reason would there be for 1,000 different identifiable species of beetle? That question obsessed both Bates and Wallace, and was to obsess them for the rest of their lives. And at the time that that photograph was taken, he and Bates had got an idea. They would pursue this passion that they had for the natural world into the tropics, where nature was at its most glorious and most varied. They would go to the Amazon. But how would they pay for a trip to the Amazon? And they had an idea. In the middle of the 19th century, which is what we're talking about, in the middle of the 19th century, a lot of people, wealthy people, people with money, loved the natural world, but loved particularly specimens. They loved specimens of hummingbirds and of colorful parrots. Some museums were building up their collections. Wealthy landowners and little nobility, they too built their great collections of bird skins and beetles and butterflies. And so did many people. And they had the idea that if they could get an agent, they would collect things out in the wilds of the Amazon, send them back home by sea, of course, and then the agent would sell these specimens. And that would enable them to go and see the natural world at its most spectacular. So, off they went next. And they went to the Amazon. And while they were there, and this is Henry Bates, who was with Wallace, they started their collections. And that meant collecting specimens of everything that they found, which they would get numerous specimens and they would send them back and get the money. And of course, that meant killing animals, certainly. And this picture, Bates had just collected a toucan, which you can see in his hand. And it relates to an incident that Bates described in his book about how the rest of the toucans came round and rioted around him, mobbed him. It's a very, very evocative and thrilling passage in his book. And after a bit, they decided that they would separate, that Bates would go off, and he would eventually go off for 11 years doing this, but Wallace would go to a tributary of the Amazon called the Rio Negro. And after being away for 4 years, he decided the time had come to go back to Britain with all the specimens that he'd got. He'd sent installments back during those 4 years, but he had the majority of his collection that he was going to take back, together with all his scientific notes. Because although this was a commercial operation, as it had to be since they didn't have any money themselves, nonetheless, it was fundamentally a scientific expedition. And he had innumerable field notes, maps, diagrams, locations as to where all the specimens had come. And so he set off from the east coast of Brazil for Britain. And 2 days out, the ship caught fire. It was an old ship, but something in the hold had caught fire, and they had to evacuate in a hurry. The ships, the little boats that they took to sea in, they too were in a appalling condition. One of them sank, and they floated around. Wallace was unable to catch any of his specimens, none whatever except a few palms and a few notes about the bottom. All the rest he had to abandon. And they floated in the Atlantic Ocean for 10 days before at last they were picked up. So you might feel that after that long experience, having got back home safely, you'd say, well, that's enough of that. Nothing. But not so. Next. Here he is, Wallace now, he's aged 30. He's starting to grow his beard. And he has decided that he's going to go now, instead of retiring and saying that's enough of being a traveling naturalist, he's decided that he would do something even trickier. He would go by himself to the Far East. And he would go and he would pay for all his trips by collecting specimens. But he had one thing particularly in mind. He wanted to collect birds of paradise. They excited him because, of course, those were very rare birds coming from the other side of the world. Collectors wanted them, and they would fetch a lot of money per head. A lot of money. £25, which of course is hundreds of pounds as it was in the 19th century. And that would pay his way. But there was another reason why he was particularly interested in birds of paradise. Next. And that is because birds of paradise had been haunting Britain, haunting Europe for hundreds of years. The first ones came back in 1522. The first man, Portuguese, to sail round the world, Magellan, when he landed, or rather, let me take you back, when he was halfway around the world, Magellan himself was killed, but his shipmates arrived in what were then the Spice Islands, and an island called Tidor. And the king of Tidor gave specimens of birds as a gift to Magellan's men. But these were very, very, very strange birds. From their flanks, they had sprouted golden plumes of a gauzy character, unlike any feathers that anyone had ever seen. Even more strange, they had a kind of shriveled head with just a little beak. They had no wings, and they had no tail, and no feet. And Magellan's men said, but why? And the people in Tidor, in the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, they had no idea, because these birds had been traded from far, far east in New Guinea. And the people who traded them, and had been doing for centuries, habitually cut off the feet and the wings in order to emphasize and expose the great glory of these fantastic plumes. But they had to say something to Magellan's men. So when Magellan's men said, why have they no feet? They made up a story. And they said, it's because these birds don't need to perch. They float perpetually in heaven, feeding on dew. And when at last Magellan's ship reached Europe, of course, European scientists said, why have they no feet? And that story was repeated, that they lived in paradise. And when in 1599, one of the first great natural history encyclopedias ever, written by a man called Ulysses Olympus, when that was published, the first volume contained that illustration of showing a bird of paradise high in the sky, feeding on dew coming down from the clouds above. But those skins that produced this story had been circulating in the Far East for centuries, and they had formed part of the regalia of the kings of Siam, and indeed of Nepal. And in case you think that we wouldn't be so silly, or Europeans wouldn't be so silly, as to bother part of regalia, birds' feathers, not at all. That is a young prince who was going to become King James I of Britain. And next, please, if you look to the left of the picture, you'll see on a table, there's his hat. And in his hat, a pair of golden plumes of the birds of paradise. But of course, eventually the truth came out, and skins began to arrive from the Far East, from New Guinea, where they originally originated, but from the Far East, which were more complete next. And then naturalists began to illustrate what the birds really were like. And the great cataloguer of the natural world, Carl Linnaeus, in the 18th century, he illustrated his books and gave names to all the species he knew of. And he called this one, which is the greater bird of paradise, he called it Paradisia apoda, which means the paradise birds without legs. Of course, he knew they had legs, it was his own little joke, but nonetheless, by the rules of science, that's what the name of that bird still is, Paradisia apoda. But still, nobody had seen the bird, no European had seen the birds in the wild. In 1824, though, a Frenchman called René Lesson was landed in New Guinea, which is where the birds live, and described it very surprisingly like a meteor, a golden meteor, zooming through the forest canopy, and realized he had been the first European to see a bird of paradise in flight and alive. This was the bird that Wallace decided he would try and collect. And he thought that the money, after discussions with Stephens, who was his agent in Europe and who was going to handle these sales, they decided that actually a skin of a bird of paradise, the golden greater bird of paradise, they could ask £100 for it, at least for the first one. He was a commercial man. Why should he not? How else is he going to get his living? The first one would be £100. The second one, £50. And then, after that, £25 each. That's what they said. So Wallace set out on his travels next week. And in 1856, he arrived in Makassar, which is in the middle of Indonesia, next week. There we are, and those blue lines represent his journeys that he was going to undertake over the next 8 years. And you would see on the left there, that is to say on the west, there's the tip of Malaysia, there's of the Malayan Peninsula, there's Java and the islands of Bali and Lombok, and just on this side of the east, New Guinea. And south of New Guinea, the Aru Islands. And Wallace, having stayed in Singapore for a bit, was going to go up to Ternate, which is up in the north on the eastern side there, on the island of, or near the island of Gilolo. Ternate is, in fact, a tiny little island. But down in the south, in the islands of Aru, Wallace discovered there was a big village, a seasonal village, where everybody went to trade for birds of paradise plumes. From there, they would go all over the Far East. So that's where Wallace went. Next. And in the main town, which is called Dobbo, there is a closer up view of the eastern part of the Spice Islands, Indonesia as it now is, New Guinea on the east, and Aru Islands down there on the south corner, southeast corner. Next. And in that village of Dobbo, he started to trade. Now, that's the general view that he put in his book. And if you look at the group in the center, next please, you'll see that there's a European figure who is, I think, supposed to be him, who is actually doing a trade with the local people. And elsewhere in that picture, you'll see cockatoos and even a tree kangaroo. So you are now in a different area. And Wallace was thrilled. And it was from here that he started talking with the hunters and trying to persuade them to take him to see what they did, how they collected the birds. Next, please. And the people explained to him how they caught these birds. The birds, they told Wallace, displayed high in the trees in groups of 20 or even 30. And that they knew where these trees were. The birds were there more or less all the year round, disporting and displaying to one another. And they would climb into the trees and with a screen of branches, kill them with actually arrows that were tipped with blunt ends so that the birds weren't badly injured, simply knocked out, and their blood plumes weren't ruined with their blood, and they fell to the ground and then were collected. Well, that was, for Wallace, a huge thrill. And he was the first European ever to see these fabulous birds, these birds theoretically without legs, these birds that theoretically lived in paradise, he was the first European to see them dancing. And he wrote in his book account of the journey an ecstatic description of what he saw. He said, 20 fully plumaged birds were elevating their exquisite plumes, keeping them in continued vibration so that the whole tree becomes filled with waving plumes in every variety of attitude and motion. Well, I read that as a boy, and it became an ambition for me to go and see the same thing. And I tried back in 1955 for the first time. And we did actually get shots of these birds in display, not this particular species, but one that has red plumes, but otherwise very similar. But it was hopeless. It was against the sky. It was black and white film. It was very early in the morning. There was very little light. And I tried again later, but eventually I got it. We went to the Fly River Delta. So with these specimens of the greater bird of paradise, he returned in triumph to his base in Ternate. And he wrote the first account in European language anywhere of what he'd seen, which was published in a magazine called the Annals and Magazine of Natural History in London. And one of the things he said in it, they are the most beautiful of all the beautiful winged forms that adorn the earth. And then, being Wallace, and down to the earth, he said, the flesh only is only to be eaten in necessity. It's dry, tasteless, and tough. But the poetry of that bird was in his heart. And in front of him, as you can see on the table, next please, he had other birds. Now these are small, little creatures barely the size of a thrush. And they also had a history, because they arrived in Britain, in Europe, very soon after those big golden plume birds. And they were called birds of paradise. Next, please. Why? Because like the big golden birds, these too had no legs. And they were figured in the natural history books with no legs. And there were myths surrounding them, just as there had been about the legless bird of paradise. And it was said that these tiny little red birds were one would appear which would lead the whole flock of the golden plume birds. And so if a hunter killed one of those, the entire flock would fall down after it and could be gathered up. All nonsense, of course. But nonetheless, they were called bird of paradise because the legend was they came from paradise. The odd thing is that today modern science recognizes that these belong to the same family, the bird of paradise family. And indeed, the bird of paradise family is huge. There are 40-odd different species of bird of paradise, ranging in size from the small ones to big ones, even bigger ones than the golden plumed. But this little red one, this kingbird of paradise, has his own particular kind of display, which he also conducts in the tree. Next, please. During all this time, all these months, weeks, months, years, that Wallace was traveling through the Indonesian islands, he was living in extremely harsh circumstances. He lived on local food almost entirely. He sailed in the flimsiest of craft. He lived in huts like this one. And that is in fact him underneath there. You can see, as he explains in his book, he's 6 foot tall. So he could barely stand upright when he was sitting in his hammock or or sitting underneath the hut working on his notes and skinning the birds and specimens that he had prepared, cutting all the boxes that were needed to keep all the birds and the butterflies and the mammals, all the things that he was collecting. And because he was living in such circumstances, it's hardly surprising that eventually he went down with a fever. What that fever was, some will say it was malaria. Others, as I was hearing this morning from people who know Indonesia better than I, it could be dengue fever. But whatever it was, he was in a high delirium. And he went to Gilolo, which is today called Halmahera, and there it lies to the west, considerably far away from New Guinea, where nearly all the birds of paradise come from. It was farther out to the west. He didn't expect to find birds of paradise. He was simply tidying things up to make sure that his survey was complete. And there, his assistant, his Malay assistant, Ali, came into camp one day holding a bird unlike any that Wallace had ever seen before. And he described it in a letter to Stephens, his agent. He said, "It's the finest and most wonderful bird in the whole island. It's a new bird of paradise of a new genus. It's quite unlike anything yet known, very curious and very handsome. When I get a couple of pairs, I'll send them overland, and then we'll see what a new bird of paradise will really fetch. I expect £25 each. I consider it the greatest discovery I've yet made." And the reason that he was so extraordinary about it was that as a bird of paradise, it had feather adornments quite unlike any other bird of that family. It has two little long white plumes sprouting from the front of each wing, which Wallace called standards. So this became known as Wallace's standard wing. And after Wallace had described it, it was only known from one location. And for a long time, all through the rest of the 19th century, nobody else made any observations. And it was thought to be lost for a very long time. But then, not so long ago, a site was found, not the same site as Wallace had seen, but in a neighboring island. And there was a display of these birds of paradise. Next, please. Like the legless bird of paradise, it displayed in trees. Wallace had now been away for nearly 8 years. He'd endured extraordinary hardships. Only those people who've traveled through this kind of country can visualize the sort of things he'd had to do. And to make these collections was extraordinarily arduous, to skin the birds with the skill so that the skins and the feathers remained in their proper fixture on the skin. Extraordinarily difficult task. Pinning all his butterflies, it was a huge, huge task. He'd made 60 to 70 separate journeys in local boats. He'd been sick, but he'd managed to collect 110,000 insects, 7,500 shells, 8,050 bird skins, 410 mammals and reptile specimens. And he had observed 5 different species of birds of paradise. But now, after 8 years, he was a tired man, and he decided that the time had come to go home. So he returned westwards across the archipelago, traversing through the seas where he had been traveling for all these years. And because he had kept such accurate notes, such accurate observations, such accurate lists of what he saw, he was able to form a picture in his mind of the distribution of all these different animals he had seen. And what he realized was that there was a line which you can see in dotted lines running from north to south, upon which the fauna suddenly changed. On the eastern side, this side, there were marsupials and like kangaroos and opossums. Among the birds, there were honey-eaters and mound-building birds called megapodes, and there were eucalyptus trees. Whereas on the western side, which included Java and Borneo, as you can see from the map, on that side, there weren't marsupials, there were placental mammals. That is to say, animals like monkeys and tigers and elephants and deer. And among the birds, there were trogons and barbets. And he wrote to his friend, Bates, with whom he conducted a regular correspondence, and said, in this archipelago, there are two distinct faunas, rigidly circumscribed, which differ as much as those of Africa and South America. Yet there's nothing on the map or on the face of the islands to mark their limits. I believe that the western part to be a separated portion of continental Asia, and the eastern part a prolongation of a former Pacific continent. And in that observation, he set the basic information of a whole new science branch of the biological sciences, a biogeographic study of the way that animals are distributed, a study which foreshadowed the discovery of the way in which the continents drift across the surface of our planet, because that's the reason. The animals of Australasia developed in isolation, and they've slowly, as Australasia, the tectonic plate under the ocean, drifted westwards and collided with the Asiatic plate. And that is the reason why there was this extraordinary change. On the surface, and I've traveled across that line several times, there's nothing for you to suppose that there's a difference. But one morning you wake up and you can hear birds that you've been listening to all over Java, and then suddenly you hear a screech of a parrot, of a cockatoo, and you know that you've changed, you've crossed Wallace's line. So he was now, when he got to Singapore, we arrived with all his collections, and there he found two living lesser birds of paradise, very like the greater bird, the golden-plumed one, just slightly smaller. And he bought two living birds of paradise, Paradisea minor as they were, that's to say the lesser bird of paradise. And he kept them alive, feeding them on bananas and cockroaches, cockroaches which he collected in biscuit tins from the ship's storerooms. And when he got to Malta, he found a rich source of cockroaches in the bakery and gave them a real bonanza. And eventually he got to London with these two birds of paradise, two lesser birds of paradise, and he sold them to London Zoo for £307 and free entry into the zoo for the rest of his life. There had been one bird of paradise that had been presented to the Queen in Windsor some 40 years before, but apart from that, these were the first living birds of paradise ever to reach Europe. Wallace, still collecting and still observing, had written his book, The Malay Archipelago. And in it, he had published more details about birds of paradise than had ever been published before. Next, please. And one of them was this little bird, which is called Parotia. And Parotia, or the six-plumed bird of paradise, is dressed in tan. I should explain. The Parotia differed from other birds of paradise. Whoa. Thanks. It differed in that, unlike the kingbird or the greater bird, which I showed you, instead of displaying up in the trees, it displayed on the ground. And each male had his own display ground. And the females toured to watch the displays. And the males are accompanied very often by juvenile males who want to see how the dances are performed and learn the dances. And the king, the dominant male, which owns an area, looks after it, keeps it absolutely spick and span. Wallace himself never saw this display, but it was again on the trip that I went to film the greater birds. We decided that we would try and see if we could also film the parotia bird display. And so we were lucky in that too. Next, please. So Wallace was properly honoured in his country. The Royal Geographic Society gave him its founder's gold medal. The Royal Society gave him its top award, the Copley Medal. 100 years ago, bar 3 days, Wallace died at the age of 90. He was, in my estimation, a great man on a number of accounts. First of all, he was a great field naturalist. Few who have ever tackled that sort of job can realize how daunting, how enervating, how wearying, how demanding that job is, and to do it for 8 years in the most of the conditions is extraordinary. He was a great scientific thinker. His theory of biogeography and Wallace's line is in itself enough to give him that. He was a great scientist. But above all, perhaps, I respect Wallace because of the humility, the generosity of spirit, the bravery, the endurance, the independence of mind, and the charity and good manners with which he dealt with everybody he met, whether they were the simplest, naked, half-naked savage in the Aru Islands or the Victorian gentleman of 19th century Europe. He died, as I said, 100 years ago. In my estimation, he was a very, very great man. Thank you very much.